On this edition of Primetime Politics, the Prime Minister calls on protesters to stop their occupation of Ottawa and blockades of Canada's vital trade links to the U.S. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford declares a provincial state of emergency, giving more powers to police to stop illegal acts. We'll hear from the head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce about the protests and their damage to the economy. And the Health Minister promises changes next week to federal border testing measures. We'll speak with a health professional about public health decisions amidst a sea of protests. And our journalists will be in to look at how the politicians are dealing with the protests and public health. But we start with the Prime Minister, who on Friday met with reporters and again called on protesters to go home, and he pointedly talked about the legal consequences they face for their continued illegal actions.
Everything is on the table because this unlawful activity has to end, and it will end. Of course, I can't say too much more now as to exactly when or how this ends, because unfortunately we are concerned about violence. So we're taking every precaution to keep people safe. If you joined the protests because you're tired of COVID, you now need to understand that you are breaking laws. The consequences are becoming more and more severe. You don't want to end up losing your license, end up with a criminal record, which will impact your job, your livelihood, even your ability to travel internationally, including to the U.S.
That was the Prime Minister speaking in Ottawa. Now, earlier in the day in Toronto, Ontario Premier Doug Ford declared a state of emergency, granting increased powers to police forces to end illegal protests. Doug Ford called for protesters to stop what he called the illegal occupation of Ottawa, now entering its third week, and the blockade of hundreds of millions of dollars of daily trade with the U.S.
To those trying to force a political agenda through disruption, intimidation, and chaos, my message to you is this: your right to make a political statement does not outweigh the right of hundreds of thousands of workers to earn their living. It does not outweigh our right to get food across our borders. Your right to make a political statement does not outweigh the rights of 1 million people in Ottawa to live peacefully, free of harassment and chaos in their own homes. So let me be as clear as I can. There will be consequences for these actions, and they will be severe.
Joining me now to look at the ongoing protests and blockades across the country and their impact on the economy is Perrin Beatty. He's the President and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce of Canada and a former federal cabinet minister. Mr. Beatty, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with, I'd like to get your response to what you heard from the Prime Minister today.
Well, I think what we're seeing from both the Ontario and federal governments is a sign that they're getting more serious about dealing with these issues before they compound further. Every single hour that goes by, more damage is done to our economy, and the damage that's done to individual Canadian families continues to grow.
How much damage are we seeing? Because we're seeing all sorts of different figures. For example, when it comes just to that Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Detroit, and the cross-border trade.
It's impossible to say with certainty because, of course, a lot of the cargo that would be going across the Ambassador Bridge is being redirected elsewhere. But and we also can't measure something else, and that's that we're hearing, for example, that companies as far away as California being asked to load produce and to come to Canada are saying if there's no guarantee we can get across the border, that there may be another incident, we're not prepared to take the risk of taking the load. So the damage is severe. It's growing. We know that thousands of people have had their shifts canceled. We know that this has had a serious impact in terms of fresh produce and in terms of the ability to get goods and services across the border. But putting an exact figure on it's impossible.
Do you, I mean, you say you're heartened by what you heard from the Prime Minister and from Ontario Premier Doug Ford with his declaration of a state of emergency in Ontario. But I mean, we've had 5 days of the interruption or the disruptions on the Ambassador Bridge. We've had 14 days in Coutts, Alberta. We've had 2 weeks here in Ottawa. How optimistic there's been a lot of talk. Are we actually going to see action, do you think?
There has to be. We simply can't allow it to continue. What we're seeing is a breakdown of the rule of law. And I guess what I would say to our elected officials of every political party and from all levels of government is it's time to put aside the partisan squabbling. It's time to put aside the disputes over jurisdiction and to put Canadians first and to assert the fact that the rule of law that's there to defend all of our freedoms is absolutely critical, and it needs to be applied without fear or favor.
Okay, you alluded to the fact that there are, in addition to the actual trade that's going on or not going on, there's possibly deferred purchases and deliveries and things that are being deferred from American producers and consumers. But there's also a lot of talk about American protectionism and Buy American. We're already facing that. How seriously do you think this is going to put more wind in the sails of people in the States who are arguing for Buy American and Produce in America? I know my colleague Peter Van Dusen yesterday was talking to the head of the Canadian auto parts manufacturers, who was talking about real fears of that.
I'm very worried about it. I'm struck, first of all, by the fact that this is damaging Canada's reputation globally. I've been receiving emails from people from around the world who say we almost never hear about Canada on our newscasts, but it's there all the time now, and not in a good way. And if you watch the American news, whether it's CNN or ABC, which I watched last night, they're leading off with what's happening at the border. And the message that people are getting is that Canada is an unreliable place to do business with. And what we're seeing is in Washington, where protectionist sentiment on both sides of the House is at record levels, we're getting people calling for manufacturing to be moved out of Canada and moved into the United States. So the long-term impact on Canada's economy may extend well beyond the actual blockade itself.
Okay, you've written an article in Policy magazine in which you say that three things are going to be necessary to address this economic crisis and these sort of rotating and growing protests and blockades. What are the three things that the government needs to do, or governments need to do?
Well, I think it's very important, first of all, that they send a clear message that the rule of law will be respected. Second, we need to make sure right now that we're hardening and protecting our infrastructure in other areas. There's a possibility that these blockades that we've seen could metastasize to other areas as well. We already have them in Coutts, Alberta. We have them in Emerson, Manitoba. We've seen the actions against the airport in Ottawa yesterday, and of course there's the blockade in downtown Ottawa as well. And we've seen demonstrations in places like Toronto and Quebec City last weekend. So there's a real concern here that people seeing the vulnerability of our logistics system may choose to simply disobey the law and to try to do damage on our ability to keep our economy functioning. We need to deal with that. We need to make sure that we've taken every appropriate action to go to the courts and make sure that the police have the authority to act and that it's clear that they have that. We need to send a message that the police have our backs, all of the elected officials' backs, that all of the elected officials have their backs. And it's very important for us to ensure that they have the supplies that they need in terms of personnel and equipment to be able to ensure that the law is enforced.
Okay, without being too much of a pessimist, though we're in an era of, we've seen now rapid mobilization through the internet and very volatile people, in these particular protests, attracting very diverse groups and being ready to be mobilized. You say we have to have enforcement. We have the legal framework already, but do we have the resources if we have this kind of concerted effort to disrupt the economy?
Well, and that's obviously a concern, and it's a discussion that we need to have after all of this is over. It was 2 years ago that we saw small groups of militants across the country severing our rail lines across the country and creating chaos then. Now we're getting a totally different group who are attacking areas of infrastructure that are critical to the Canadian economy and to Canadian families' well-being. We need to ask ourselves, are there further measures that we need to take to protect our infrastructure in the future? But as things stand today, the critical point is this, that we need to ensure that the message is sent clearly, that our elected officials at all levels believe in the rule of law. They will make available any resources at all levels of government to ensure that order is maintained and that the Canadian economy is able to function effectively and that Canadians can go back about their ordinary lives.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a blunt question. You used to be in the political arena for a good 20 years, former federal minister. You know how this works, and a former conservative. You have the federal Conservative Party who is playing footsie with endorsing these protests. You have provincial premiers who are galloping ahead, removing vaccine mandates. This all would seem, it's being interpreted as emboldening the protesters. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't want to get into any one political party. What I would say to every elected official at every level of government, irrespective of political party, the fundamental guarantee of our rights and freedoms as Canadians is the fair and even-handed application of the rule of law. We spoke out 2 years ago when small groups of militants were attempting to sever our rail system in Canada. Exactly the same principles apply here. No small group has the ability to declare themselves beyond the law and to try to create paralysis within Canada, to hold Canadians to ransom for their political goals. Okay. And all of our elected officials have a responsibility to make it clear that they can't support that.
Okay, Perrin Beatty, I want to thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
All week, provincial premiers have been announcing plans to lift public health measures. Some provinces, like Alberta and Saskatchewan, have already announced they're scrapping vaccine mandates, testing requirements, and public masking. And the federal health minister on Friday said he and Dr. Theresa Tam will be announcing changes next week to Ottawa's border testing measures. Joining me now from Montreal to look at what's happening and where things are headed is Dr. Christopher Labos. Dr. Labos, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Can we ask, let's start with that specific question about one of the things we heard today, and that was that we're going to get some sort of announcement concerning federal measures, border testing. One of the most criticized, controversial measures these days in terms of whether it's necessary and whether it's effective is that second PCR test, the airport arrival test that travelers have to have when they arrive in Canada. What's your feeling? What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, in the theoretical sense, the more widely we can test people, the better off we're going to be because you identify cases early and you're able to get people to isolate earlier. It's very clear that if you've already tested negative before you got on the plane, the likelihood that you're going to catch somebody when they're coming off is actually obviously lower. And so in a situation where testing capacity is very limited, I think, people have made the argument that maybe we should be redirecting resources towards more community testing rather than testing at the airport. And I think that's a fair point. I think what we have to be worried about is not taking things too far and saying, let's abolish all testing altogether, because while the threat of a new variant now is relatively low, I mean, there's nothing on the horizon to suggest that. We have to be mindful of the fact that 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the road, if there are new variants that emerge, if we have no type of border testing in place, then we're not going to be able to at least control or mitigate the spread of a new variant into this country. So it's going forward, it's always a question of balance and reassessment. It's fine to sort of reallocate resources now as long as we have some sort of plan in place to scale things back up should it become necessary at some point in the future.
More generally, if we take a big step back, what are your thoughts as you see both these escalating or continuing protests and the fact that provincial governments are announcing outright the scrapping of vaccine mandates?
So I think it's this. I mean, clearly the situation from the epidemiological perspective is improving. So I think it's reasonable at this point to relax restrictions. And in fact, governments were always going to do this, and this was sort of the plan going forward. What's a little bit hard for me to understand is that if you're going to make the argument that the risk of future outbreaks is less because we have such a high vaccination rate, why would you then want to dismantle the very programs that have encouraged vaccination and keep people safe? So there seems to be a little bit of a logical inconsistency here. I mean, I think it's a fair point to say that vaccines are going to mitigate the risk of severe outbreaks in the future, but we have to continue to encourage people to get vaccinated. There's still a rather large minority of adults who have not been vaccinated. There's still children who need to be vaccinated to make school safer. So there's still some ways to go. So backing away from, encouraging people to get vaccinated doesn't strike me as the best course of action. If anything, we should be encouraging people to get vaccinated so that we don't have to do lockdowns in the future. So there seems to be, at least to my mind, a bit of a logical inconsistency in some of the things that people are saying.
Okay, on a philosophical level, because for 2 years now we've been discussing with public health specialists, with medical specialists, with epidemiologists. We've been talking to people like you. Do you think provincial governments are making their decisions now based more on protests and on a widespread evaluation of public willingness to comply with restrictions? And is that good?
So yeah, I think some of that is entering into the calculation, definitely. I think you're seeing issues being driven not purely by science, but reflecting the public mood. And that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, you do need public buy-in for any type of major public health measure. The one word of caution, though, is you can't let things go too far because we've been down this sort of road before. We've had situations where governments have announced the end of all COVID restrictions. You had these, open for summer plans and let's eliminate and let's downscale COVID testing because everything's going to be fine. Things may be fine now, but there's always the potential that they may not be fine in the future. We don't know what the future holds. And so the possibility that there might be a future more infectious variant is not outside the realm of possibility. I mean, people were predicting the end of COVID after the Delta variant, and then the Omicron variant hit. So we don't know what's going to happen in the fall or next winter. So I don't think it's wrong to loosen restrictions now, especially if there is a public willingness to make that happen, as long as we have a contingency plan in place to be able to reintroduce stuff as it becomes necessary. So the analogy that I've used with people too is that, if you have a flood in your region and you have to evacuate your house, and when the flood is over, you say, well, we're never going to, let's hope this never happens again. I mean, obviously you hope that it never happens again, but, in the back of your mind, you have to acknowledge that if there was ever a second flood, you would again have to evacuate that area. So our response has to be dictated by the situation on the ground, and it can't be driven exclusively by philosophy and by what people want. It has to be driven by the data, and if the data shows a new variant that's causing exponential growth, we have to be ready to respond to that and not, simply be willing to ignore it.
Okay, Dr. Christopher Labos, thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure. You take care.
I'm joined now by two members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Tonda MacCharles is the national political reporter for the Toronto Star, and Janet Silver is a managing editor at iPolitics. Both of you, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, I wanted to start with, there's been so much going on today, but let's start with the Prime Minister, his latest briefing with reporters and through them to Canadians on the standoff with the protesters. What do you make of it? What stands out for you, Tonda?
What stood out for me was that this was the Prime Minister who has all along said he doesn't direct police operations, nonetheless very aware of a coming crackdown and issuing a notice and a warning to protesters that with the new state of emergency in the province of Ontario and all the reinforcements that the RCMP and the OPP have sent to Windsor and Ottawa, there's a big crackdown coming. He has tread a line very carefully all through this. He said again today he's not using or invoking federal emergency measures to bring in the military, that this is the police matter. He raised a really interesting doubt, I think, and concern about the planning and approach of the Ottawa police to this ongoing 15-day protest here. But he's clearly signaling to protesters that it's about to get very rough. Okay, Janet, what did you take from that? What stood out for you?
When he said all options are on the table, he made a very direct appeal to the truck protesters, saying, it's time to go home. Just picking up on what Tonda was saying. If you don't, there's going to be huge fines, which is what Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, said earlier today, up to $100,000. There could potentially be job penalties. Police will use the force that they need to end the blockade. Mm-hmm. They are putting everything out there that this is it.
Okay, well, and you both alluded to it then. Let's get to the other big announcement today, and that was Doug Ford from Ontario, from Toronto, his announcement of a state of emergency, a provincial state of emergency. The two obviously fit together. It's been so long, though, that these situations have been going on. We're in the 15th day of the blockade in Ottawa. We're in the 5th day of the occupation or the interruptions at the Ambassador Bridge, and Doug Ford now comes out. What do you make of his statement today? Very clearly, look, we've had the impact of the border blockage at Windsor has changed the equation politically for everybody. Look, it's 15 days now that Alberta at the Coots Crossing and here in Ottawa has been jammed with trucker convoys. And I think the economic blow to the auto manufacturing industry and the layoffs we've seen and the pressure coming from the U.S.
That changed everything. Why now remains a big question. Why has it taken so long for the province to act, for the feds to signal their intentions? Were they all afraid of looking like they would embolden protesters or look like they were caving? But I think that is a big backstory we hope to hear over the coming days.
Janet, what about, Tonda made an allusion to it, and the Prime Minister was asked about it. Tonda, I think you asked him about it, but also Doug Ford. The connection with the United States. I mean, when we have reports that Homeland Security is offering help, when the governor of Michigan is talking about the economic impact, and when there's a discussion between the Prime Minister and President Biden about the economic impact, and he supposedly assured the White House that I'm getting on this.
Well, yeah, because it also draws in the whole question. If you look south of the border and they say, look, we'll help, we'll send in, whatever assistance you need, then you start to ask questions about jurisdiction, right? And whether or not we do have control over, Canada has control over its own border. There's huge pressures. Look, we're talking thousands and thousands of people who haven't been able to work. That standoff on the bridge, Ambassador Bridge, that connects Windsor to Detroit, that started on Monday evening, or sometime on Monday. There's a lot of jobs at stake, a lot of businesses in downtown Ottawa that has closed. What's going on in Coutts, Alberta, which is affecting livestock being transported between the borders. It's to a point where there's so much on the table economically between the two countries. And when you hear Republicans south of the border going, look, if you can't do it, it's another reason why we need to do Made in America, that sends a real chill down a lot of spines when you think of just how much potentially could be lost if the blockades aren't brought to an end in terms of jobs that could go elsewhere.
I think that's a point we've heard from, especially from Ford, but also from industry, that this is really doing damage to Canada's reputation as a reliable trading partner. And in an era where all countries are trying to sort of, retrench, and especially south of the border, the Buy America movement is so strong. This kind of handicaps a lot of people's ability to say no. Canada's reliable pipeline. Okay,
I want to look at the domestic, and by that I mean Ottawa politics. This time last week, we were talking about Candace Bergen, the then just newly minted interim leader of the Conservatives, and we were looking at an email where she'd encouraged her MPs not to call for the end of the occupation of Ottawa. Now we have a change in positions. Candace Bergen and some of her MPs are saying, no, the truckers, it's time for them to go home, as well as the truckers in Coutts, Alberta, and the truckers at the Ambassador Bridge and elsewhere. But at the same time, you have the man who would like to have the permanent job as leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, openly running and openly being continuously supportive of the truckers. What do you make of it? Tonda?
Yeah, 2 days ago, he said the Freedom March, is moving onward, keep it going. He is directly trying to appeal to the broad swath of Canadians who may not be even in alignment with blocking a legislature or a border point, but are fed up with restrictions. And we know from polls that a lot of people are fed up with restrictions. So this is a blatantly, baldly populist appeal by Poilievre to get votes to line up support for his bid at the Conservative leadership. And, we'll see how it resonates. But there are a lot of people pretty concerned about the rhetoric and the positions the Conservative Party has taken, a party that traditionally has been the law and order party, all about, peaceful, democratic process, all of that. And after the last 2 weeks and the shifting positions of the party, of its interim leader, of several of its prominent members, I think a lot of Canadians could be forgiven for wondering what on earth does it stand for.
Yeah, Janet, your thoughts on the Conservatives? Because I have one last question about a little bigger picture.
Well, I guess just to go back to the United States again, when you see and hear a lot of Republicans south of the border, and I'm pointing to people like Ted Cruz, for example, Republican out of Texas, going, yes, we support the Freedom Convoy, go truckers, go. And you hear that kind of message, and those are the same Republicans that did not condemn the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. There are a lot of people that are going, wait a second, is that the way that the Conservative Party is going by touting and supporting the truckers? It does leave a lot of questions out there as to how far down that road some in the Conservative Party are willing to go, and what kind of divisions that could potentially mean for the party, for the more moderates, and where they go.
Okay, a last question is a bigger question. That is, what do you think Canadians should make of it, or what do you make of it? The fact that we have these protests going on, and at the same time, we have provincial governments galloping towards removing vaccine mandates and other measures, and we have the federal government saying that it is going to be revising some of its border measures. What do you make of, is it a risk or is it just reality, the perception that political pressure and protests are now influencing public policy more than public health?
Well, public policy has always been affected by public perception. Public health wasn't supposed to be. But I think we can see that across the country, the disease picture is different in lots of different jurisdictions. I don't think there's any question in many people's minds that some of the easing and the quick lifting of everything, for example, all mask mandates gone for children in Alberta soon, and that sort of thing, there are lots of questions about just how politically influenced those decisions were. But the disease has evolved, and the federal health authorities today said that we can't avoid the reality that Omicron has peaked. It is also impossible to sustain, the belief that we can eliminate it or eliminate all risk of importing it at the borders. So for sure, political and public perceptions have affected this, but certainly on the federal scene, at least what they're saying is that public health evidence and science-based policy is what's driving the bid to next week change some of those measures. Yeah,
Janet, is there not a political risk for the Prime Minister and his government if they're seen as caving to illegal protests?
Well, exactly. There is a risk for that, but therefore, that's why when he was asked about that today, he was very careful in talking about they go back to science and pointing to science as being their way forward. And I would add one thing in terms of what Tonda was saying as well. We've got the Super Bowl coming up on Sunday, and we're watching sports games that happen in the United States, and you see auditoriums and theaters, they're filled to capacity with spectators. And here in Canada, it's a very different situation. I think there's a lot of pressure to say, we're 2 years into this next month, and it's not as serious in terms of death and hospitalizations and ICUs. Maybe it is a chance to try to ease up a little bit. There's a lot of pressure from business and other groups to do that, but this government is always, quick to say we will ease up as science allows us to do that. They rely on science for that information.
Okay, Janet Silver, Tonda MacCharles, thank you both. Thanks for taking the time, and we'll speak again.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for another edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Martin Stringer. Thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.